In summer of 2008, the world will visit China as Beijing hosts the Summer Olympic Games. What will the Western public see, and how will we understand those events? Popular wisdom believes that hosting the Olympics will loosen the reins of autocracy. Recent events in Tibet seem to point in a different direction. What do the recent events in Tibet mean? How did the initial peaceful demonstrations of Buddhist monks turn into a violent public uprising? What does the Chinese government's military crackdown suppressing the protests mean for the future? What is the role of His Holiness the Dalai Lama in the current unrest? Why is this violence erupting now? These are the questions which I hope our speaker, Dr. Lobsang Sanjay, who has been following events in Tibet very closely, will address as he looks at human rights in China through a Tibetan lens. Lobsang Sanjay is the first Tibetan to earn a doctoral degree from Harvard Law School. He accomplished this in 2004, focusing his dissertation research on Democracy Distress, Is Exile Polity a Remedy? A case study of Tibet's government in exile. While at Harvard, he organized 5 conferences between Chinese and Tibetan scholars, including a rare meeting between His Holiness the Dalai Lama and 35 mainland Chinese scholars. Currently a senior fellow at the East Asian Legal Studies program at Harvard Law School, Dr. Sanjay is a regular consultant on Tibetan issues for major news media, including the BBC, the Washington Post, and here at the Boston Globe. The Cambridge Forum welcomes Lobsang Sanjay.
Thank you, Dr. Gordon. And I was also introduced as doctor. So he's doctor of medicine, and I'm a doctor of law. In Tibetan, when you try to make a differentiation, you call it doctor of brain. That makes me neurosurgeon. I'm not a neurosurgeon. And I'm also glad that as a lawyer, the sponsor also seems to be a law firm. But I would like to make a distinction that I'm a human rights lawyer, a Buddhist lawyer, if that means something. And I would like to thank Pat and the Cambridge Forum for organizing this talk. And thank you all for coming. It's a sad and unfortunate thing that is happening in Tibet. And with heavy heart, I'll try to share what's going on. So let me start with saying this. China wants to be a great nation. History has shown that greatness cannot be bought in the marketplace, cannot be bought with force. Greatness must be earned. Many Chinese people feel, and quite rightly, that they were victimized by the imperial powers of Japan and Great Britain. Some of my Chinese friends have shared this tragic history with such passion and emotion as to how Chinese were mistreated, humiliated, and terrorized just because China was weak and while imperial powers were powerful. Hearing their side of the story, I felt for them and continue to do so. In the last 50 years, China has transformed itself from a poor nation to a booming economy, and the world is mesmerized by the rapid modernization of China. The leaders talk about harmony among their people and a harmonious society. The people themselves, given their renewed confidence, they want the 21st century to be China's century. They want to be a superpower, and a great superpower at that. If they could, I would say, good for them. However, if history is any guide, powerful nations have come and gone. And some are remembered for their greatness. Some are remembered for their horrors. Many empires have come and gone. Some have tried to impose their greatness through force, and they have failed. Some have tried to buy greatness, and they have failed too. Only those nations which earn their greatness have left a legacy in the world, which goes into the history books as illustrious and magnanimous. Those powers which resorted to brute force to impose their will under leaders like Hitler, Mao Zedong, and Pol Pot will be remembered for their terror and savagery. While the true great leadership of peoples like Mahatma Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, and Martin Luther King are remembered because they rose above petty power politics and used their leadership to serve humanity and set noble examples for others to follow. China, as a nation, has a choice to make. The Chinese leaders have a choice to make. Not just talk the good talk, but walk the walk. Do they want to be remembered for their truly great leadership in a time of crisis, and in this way assure China a place in the pantheon of great nations? Or do they want to be remembered as weak leaders who resorted to knee-jerk reactions and completely tarnish China's reputation and destroyed an opportunity for greatness? Unfortunately, what is happening in Tibet today affirms the second scenario. However, there is a chance to salvage the situation. Let me make a proposal about how Chinese leaders can rise to the occasion. First, if China wants to be a great nation, then the leadership must show its confidence by allowing international media to enter Tibet, not on guided tours like they're doing today, but freely and openly, to investigate and report objectively as to why the uprising happened, not just in Lhasa, but in 50 other places in Tibet. United Nations and human rights experts must be allowed to investigate the political and human rights situation and make the reports available to the whole world. This should follow international law and UN guidelines to give unfettered access to experts so that they could get to the root cause, the bottom of the uprising. Great nations are expected to respect and follow international norms. China says it has nothing to hide and that truth is on its side. If so, China can follow what Deng Xiaoping famously said, to prove truth from facts. If China is interested in finding the truth, then it can follow the South African model by establishing a truth commission and have Tibetans come up and confess what they did, why they did it. Their confession is enough. This will be duly noted and forgiven. No arrest, no punishment. The public hearing will be a venue for people to share their true feelings so that the Chinese government could adapt their policies to reflect the aspirations of the Tibetan people. If China is a great nation, it will act on these suggestions. If it is not, its leaders will try to hide the truth from the international community and instead issue orders to police and security to work in the middle of the night to arrest and imprison freedom fighters, men and women, lay and monks who participated in the uprising. Its government will clamp down on people and create an environment of fear and paranoia. On the climate of fear in Tibet, let me share a story with you about a 49-year-old Tibetan who is in the audience actually, a Tibetan American living right here in Boston. A few days ago, he called his mother, living in Tibet, and asked her, "How are you?" She said, "Not good." When asked why, she replied, "Two of your siblings have been taken to the hospital." The son asked, "Was this because of an old disease or a new disease?" The mother said, "An old disease, but the doctor said the prognosis is not good." Then she said, "Son, don't call me for a while, and she hung up. I'm sure you can understand the gist of the story. In short, the son called to find out about his mother. The mother said 2 of his siblings were taken to prison. The son asked whether this was for protest they were involved in recently or long time ago. The mother said they were taken because of the old protest. They had not participated in the new one. But still the Chinese police told the mother that her children will be imprisoned for some time. Would this conversation happen in a great nation? Or is this a conversation that happens in a nation in fear? Why does anyone have to talk in coded words? Why did this mother have to end her phone conversation in 2 minutes and say, "Son, don't call me for a while," even though she's alone with her children in prison? Why would anyone arrest someone who had participated in a demonstration 20 years ago and had already suffered in prison for their participation? Neither the mother nor the children are at fault, but the Chinese government is rounding up the usual suspects and innocent people, both those who participated and those who abstained in the recent uprising. This is not an exception. This is happening everywhere in Tibet, especially in 50 areas where protests and uprising took place. Hundreds are put behind bars for no fault of theirs. On March 18th, BBC reported that 600 monks were flown in military planes from Lhasa to Chengdu, the capital city of neighboring province, which means prisons in Tibet are overflowing, and prisoners now have to be transported to the inner parts of China. This tragic reality, the terrible way the government has clamped down on the people, will make the rest of the world remember China not as a great nation with visionary leadership, but as an authoritarian regime with misguided leadership. Finally, would a great nation make outrageous claims about the causes of dissent? And yet here too, this is how China has reacted to recent events. The Chinese leadership has the audacity to blame on His Holiness Dalai Lama for the uprising in Tibet. They say the Dalai Lama is the mastermind and instigator behind the tragedy. Let me tell how they are wrong on this. Historical facts will testify that it is the 50 years of failed policies of the Chinese government is the root cause of the problem. As you all might know, Tibet was occupied by Communist China in 1950. In the early part of 1951, the Dalai Lama moved to a border of India. In a heartbreaking note, he learned that the 17-point agreement was signed between his representative and the Chinese government under duress and the threat of military occupation. Even so, the Dalai Lama decided to return to Lhasa, that's the capital city, to try to work on the agreement. Soon it became very clear that the Communist Party was more interested to consolidate their power in Tibet and not even interested to implement their own agreement. Frustrated, in 1959, the Dalai Lama decided to flee to India. Tibet erupted in flames, with thousands revolting against the Chinese occupation. They were violently crushed. In early 80s, the paramount leader of China, Deng Xiaoping, said, "Other than independence, anything can be discussed on Tibet." The Dalai Lama sent 2 delegations to Beijing in 1982 and 1984. During actual negotiations, the Chinese government offered to restore the political status and privileges of the Dalai Lama and not the freedom of the Tibetan people. So Dalai Lama refused, saying he is not interested in his own personal power, but the welfare of the 6 million Tibetans. The negotiation failed. Shortly thereafter, in 1987, 88, 89, Lhasa erupted in flames with thousands of monks and nuns and lay people revolting against the Chinese government. Once again, they were crushed. Recently, from 2002 until last year, the Dalai Lama sent 6 delegations to China to have dialogue with the Chinese counterpart. But each time, they returned empty-handed. Many Tibetans believed that the Chinese government was taking the Dalai Lama for a ride. Their palpable frustration and their resentment from the long chain of injustice inflicted by the Chinese government helped catalyze the recent uprising in Tibet. Despite the shootings, imprisonment, and starvation of his supporters, the Dalai Lama reiterated his long-held principle that if Tibetan movement becomes violent, he will resign from the political leadership. And despite calls for boycott, he believes that it is in the best interest of China and the world to hold the Summer Olympics in Beijing. He restates his willingness to negotiate with the Chinese leadership anytime, anywhere on the future status of Tibet. He goes out of his way to say that he is not seeking independence, nor he is seeking to split China, but he wants genuine autonomy within the framework of the Chinese constitution. Dalai Lama has given speech after speech on peace and nonviolence. He has participated in interfaith dialogues to promote harmony between different religions. Not once he has spoken or written against Chinese people or China as a nation. What does the Chinese government do in return? They call him the wolf in monk's robe, a devil with a human face. They declare the current outbreak of dissent to be a life and death struggle. They say that they will crush the Tibetan uprising once and for all. Is this the language of a great nation or great leader? I'm sad to say it is not. As you can note from the above historical facts, the unfortunate truth is this. Had the Chinese government given even a single concession to the Dalai Lama, this tragedy could have been prevented, or at least postponed. The Chinese leaders talk about creating a harmonious society, but they unleash Han chauvinism and Chinese nationalism against Tibetan people. They repeatedly show footages of some Tibetans beating up Chinese people in Lhasa, shops being vandalized with underlying message that Tibetans hate us. However, they ignore uprising in other 50 different places of Tibet. This negative propaganda builds resentment and hatred among Chinese people towards Tibetan people, which means the Chinese government is pitting 1.2 billion Han Chinese against 6 million Tibetans. Is this the picture of a harmonious society? Despite all these vitriolic statements, even today the Dalai Lama still extends his hands of moderation and compromise. This is an act of a true great leader. Is there a Chinese leader who will rise to the occasion and embrace the hands of the Dalai Lama so that China can avoid becoming like Imperial Japan and Great Britain, which humiliated and terrorized Chinese people when they were weak? China knows very well what it is to be like to be a victim. So isn't it time to stop treating Tibetans like the way Chinese suffered themselves? Let me conclude with a hope and a prayer that the united and universal cry of Tibetans from all parts of Tibet, that is, long live the Dalai Lama, and the Dalai Lama return to Tibet, to the land he belongs to the land where he was born, to the people who are fervently loyal and dedicated, will be realized. Otherwise, Tibetans will rise again and again. Tibet will burn again and again. Whether this type of tragedy is what Chinese leaders want or not is their prerogative. But we know for sure, great leaders don't want such tragedy. Great nations don't want such tragedy. Clearly, the ball is in the court of China. If China grabs this ideal opportunity and rise to the occasion, surely it will join the pantheon of great nations, and Tibetans will live harmoniously with their freedom and their leader in Tibet. Thank you.
Thank you. I've been told to say you're joining us at the Cambridge Forum, listening to Lobsang Sanjay discussing Tibet. It's my opportunity to ask a question as well. But first, before I do, I want to tell you about Lobsang, Yashi, Teshi, Nagwang, people who come to my office on a daily basis who are Tibetans. They come to my office because in Tibet, they said, "Free Tibet," or "Long live His Holiness the Dalai Lama," and were put in prison for 10 years, every day tortured, electrocuted. They come to my office with re-experiencing, unable to sleep because they have nightmares, they have flashbacks during the day when they see things, they reminds them of the prison and where they've been. They avoid situations where there are crowds or where there's something that might stimulate them. They avoid thoughts, they avoid thinking, because they have such sadness in their heart. They have hypervigilance. They are constantly on alert and worried about people harming them. They have meditation problems with their meditation practice because they have flashbacks. None of us are free until Tibet is free. The question I have for you, and I'm going to ask the first question and then we'll leave for the audience to ask questions, is I was wondering if you could comment on what you think is and should be the role of the West, and the U.S. in particular, in this struggle.
I think President George Bush, I think, should make a public statement. He has been saying that he has been conveying his thoughts privately to the Chinese leadership. I think it's good to come out, not just America, but Western world as well as whole world, and strongly condemn what's happening in Tibet. And as I said, the demand that if China has nothing to hide, then they should allow international media, UN experts, to go in and find out the truth. And then, we are willing, Tibet, as far as Tibetans are concerned, we are willing to listen to the truth, the real report, the objective report, whatever that be. We will listen and we will consider. I think that is crucial. Based on that, if atrocities are going on, if punishments are meted, if people are put behind bars for no fault of theirs, and accordingly the world should react and think of how to deal with China.
And of course, one of the things that we can do here is the demonstration that was right here in Harvard Square. But what other things do you think we can do here as activists to try to deal with the problem?
You can write to your congressmen, your senators. You can call Washington, D.C., the Congress as a whole. Nancy Pelosi visited Dharamsala, but Congress as a whole and Senate as a whole, they're yet to come out with a statement as to their stand on what's happening in Tibet. Some individual senators and presidential candidates have spoken, but they're yet to come out with a statement. I think it's crucial that world speak out and then make sure that Tibetans who are suffering, their voices will be heard and reflected through government stand and their policies. And there are a couple of issues, actually. French foreign minister said it. Now Belgium and France, actually, they are not ruling out, boycotting, not the Olympics, but the ceremony, the first day ceremony of the Olympics, Similarly, actually, there are others. The Polish Prime Minister has also stated to that effect, and some other provinces have also stated to that effect. So these are the issues worth considering.
Thank you. Well, at this point, this is a forum, hence the term conversation. And so this is the opportunity for anyone who has any question to come up to the microphone here. It'd be helpful if you introduce yourself and ask a question and try to be as succinct as possible. Please come up to the microphone.
I'll be first because I'm close. I'm interested in knowing something about the conversations that you've had in the past with your colleagues in China. That was referred to as some of the part of what you had done at the Harvard Law School. I also, in monitoring some of the websites, have seen a list, I think, of 39 Chinese dissidents who wrote quite a powerful statement that mirrored your point of view. There ought to be an international observer coming in and that kind of thing. Is that the combination of those, could there be people inside of China who are equally frustrated with this as the people in Tibet, and they are perhaps, through some of the offices that you've had here in the United States, able to move in that direction?
Thank you.
Thank you. In China as a whole, actually, as I said, Chinese government is showing footage of that, few Tibetans, young Tibetans, and there are some conspiracy theories as to whether these were, planned and instigated by the Chinese intelligence or the army itself. There are some couple of reports on that, actually, but the one suspicious one is that the James Miles from The Economist and a couple of tourists said when these 20 or some Tibetans, young Tibetans, came over to start vandalizing shops and burning things and flipping cars, for 6 hours, 6 to 12 hours, the two accounts, the whole Chinese police and the army withdrew and disappeared and let these people have their way. And they knew there was a journalist, right? And the only people who were there from the Chinese authorities were the intelligence people shooting video cameras and photographs. So where in China you have heard of there people rioting and vandalizing, then the police and the army decide to pull out. So there are some conspiracy theories that maybe this is planted by the Chinese authorities. But having said that, they're showing these footages again and again. Now, and in general, what has happened is that the Han Chinese especially, the sense of nationalism and Han chauvinism is really being provoked to the extent that many Chinese feel some kind of resentment and hatred towards Tibetans, because there are some accounts of Tibetan monks traveling around in Shenzhen and Shanghai, other places, where they have faced a group of Chinese coming and shouting at them, if not beating them up. So this is very sad, because on the one hand, the Chinese government says Tibetans, are part of China. They are our people, right? And we want to create a harmonious society. On the other hand, you unleash this evil sense of hatred towards Tibetan people. So for Tibetans, we see it as saying, okay, the Chinese government really doesn't think we are Chinese. We are different. Otherwise, why would you provoke one side of the community against another side of the community? The government job is to promote harmony. If there are tension, the government job is to minimize it, bring it down. But they are provoking it. That's the sad part. So it's very bold and courageous of these 27 or 8 Chinese, prominent Chinese actually, scholars, lawyers, to speak out against the Chinese government and say, you should stop this propaganda. This is not the way to do it. And what Chinese government really should do is allow international media, the UN experts, to come and do real research, do real finding, investigation, and come out with a report, and which both Tibetans and Chinese should listen to. That's very bold of them, actually. And then there are a couple of other movie makers have also come out saying in support of Tibetan people. But I would like to say, these are not what we call in coordination with Tibetans outside. These people are doing it voluntarily. Of course, there's one prominent Chinese author whose wife is Tibetan. Other than that, actually, they are doing voluntarily. It's very courageous of them, and we should applaud it, actually. Now, as for my role at Harvard, what I've been doing actually for the last 10 years is to promote dialogue between Chinese and Tibetan scholars. I invite Chinese scholars from China to come to Harvard to discuss on all aspects of Tibet. And I've organized, as Dr. Gordon said, 6 conferences so far. And we have discussed every aspect of Tibetan issue. The last one we had was November 27 and 28 of last year, during which we discussed about historical status of Tibet, security and autonomy, demography in Tibet, whether how many Chinese are there now, and definition and demarcation of Tibet, and the prospect, challenges and opportunities for dialogue between His Holiness, the Dalai Lama's representative and the Chinese government. So in that sense, we have discussed all key points. Unfortunately, my effort for this Track 2 initiative is to promote dialogue and understanding, is to prevent such kind of disaster or tragedy from happening in Tibet. I feel guilty myself, actually. Maybe I did too little, maybe too late. That's why I could not do it. But at the same time, I also feel maybe there are a lot of blames to go around, actually, including me, perhaps Tibetan people. We should have done more. Perhaps international community as a whole, we could have done more. And there are some usual suspects like multinationals, whose bottom line is profit, and they will do anything for their profit margin and hide human rights and freedom under the carpet. And also there are other unusual suspects. There are some China experts who we call panda huggers, who will just go to cities of China and talk to who is who of China, and then don't go to peripheries of Tibet, other areas. And they just come back and say they're mesmerized. They say China is great, it's booming. Of course it's booming in urban areas, but what about rural areas? What about Tibet and Xinjiang? And then they say, oh, they ignore it, Their attitude is somewhat like Han chauvinism to some extent, actually. And then when this crisis built up, they say, what's going on? I didn't know about it. Yes, you didn't know about it because you never went to these places. And in fact, you have always maintained or reiterated Chinese propaganda line, And then there are some Tibet experts, so-called Tibetologists, Of course, they study Tibet. But the self-censorship is so great. The fear that they won't get visa to go to Tibet to research is so great. They try to, fudge the reality and come out with their writings, reports, and articles as though everything is okay. I have had many discussions, Now suddenly it boils over and they say, what's going on? I didn't know about it, So there are a lot of blames to go around, but I don't think today is a day to blame, everybody. Today is a day to try to take in the tragic reality in Tibet, and hopefully we will prevent such things from happening. So in that, we all have a role, a positive role, and not just for Tibet, for many other issues around the world. And I hope we all will take our role seriously.
Come to the microphone if you have a question.
Hello, I'm Marcus Graley. This past summer, I spent several weeks in Inner Mongolia, which is another one of these ethnic minority regions. And one of the things I observed there is the Mongolians, my brother was a teacher there at a Mongolian college, so we had a lot of contact with them, are really a minority. They're maybe 15% of population, and it's mostly Han Chinese. And there is this sort of resentment, but it's almost like it's no longer a Mongolian province, it's a Chinese province that has some Mongolians in it. And to what extent do you think with the railroad and the increased Chinese settlement in Tibet, that played a role in the current crisis? And what comments, or how would you say this is linked to the other ethnic minorities like the Uyghurs in Xinjiang and the Mongolians and so forth?
Excellent question.
Thank you for that question. Actually, China has this grand plan to marginalize all the so-called minorities and and overwhelm these areas with Chinese population. This plan has been on for more than centuries, actually. Inner Mongolia, actually, is a case where they have succeeded to a great extent. The most success they have had is Manchuria, where if you go to Manchuria, they're almost like 1 Chinese for every, 10 Chinese for every Manchurian. In Inner Mongolia, I think it's more like 4 Chinese for every 1 Mongolian. And in Xinjiang, it's like 50, almost 60% Chinese for 40+% of Uyghur. And in the case of Tibet, if you look at the border areas, I think some areas, Chinese are majority. For example, the birthplace of Dalai Lama, I think 90% are Chinese. If you go to urban areas like Lhasa, of the 300,000 population, almost 200 plus are Chinese. Having said that, the inner Tibet are still Tibetan majority. So China has not succeeded for one reason. That has nothing to do with generosity of the Chinese government. That has everything to do with the landscape of Tibet. It's so high, it's so cold. So most of the Chinese who come to Tibet, they leave during winter, you know. So that's why it has managed to maintain majority population. Having said that, actually, we are also going the path of Inner Mongolia, Manchuria, and Xinjiang. And that's their plan. They want to marginalize. And by building this road, they think that they can bring in so many Chinese population that they can overwhelm Tibetan population. If you look at the railway track of Xinjiang, you will see soon after the railway track, before the railway track, the population was, minimal. After the railway track, wherever the railway track is, it's populated by Chinese. So that's what they did in Inner Mongolia as well. So that is the future that China is planning for Tibet, and that's why you can clearly see why Tibetans are so frustrated. Because with this incoming of Chinese population, they take their jobs, right? That's why they burn shops, not because Tibetans, they're acting in the free environment. There's just some free youth Tibetans, they just went around and vandalized things. No, the shoppers, the shopkeepers, the tourist guide are agents or instrument of marginalization of Chinese government policies. So when you see shops and restaurants around, majority are owned or run by Chinese. If you go to schools, for example, in Tibet University, there is a law department. In 2003, they had 9 lecturers, of which 2 were Tibetans. Now in 2004, they hired 9 more lecturers, all 9 were Chinese. And in 2006, the Chinese government came out with this, province-level job opportunity for anyone to apply. And afterwards, they gave 100 jobs, of which only 2 were Tibetans. 98 were non-Tibetans. And if you look at the political structure of the 13 top leaders of the Communist Party in Tibet, or in Tibet Autonomous Region, 7 are Chinese. Only 6 are Tibetans. If you look at the local assembly, almost 35% of the assembly members are Chinese. If you look at the judiciary, top judges at the province level and the prefecture level are all Chinese. Now the Chinese government says only 8% of population of Tibet Autonomous Region are Chinese. If 8% takes so much power, what does it say about autonomy? Because the premises on which China came to Tibet is one thing. They said they're going to transform Tibet into a socialist paradise. Now they say they're going to modernize Tibet and the primary beneficiary will be Tibetans. But sadly, it is not the case. Primary beneficiary is Chinese. Hence, Tibetans are saying enough is enough. This is not what we want. We want our own land. We want our own freedom. We are capable of governing ourselves. And that is the fight. That's why there is tragedy, not just in Lhasa, but in 50 other areas and increasing every day.
Go to the microphone. Just use the microphone. Yeah. There you go.
Lawson, I'm Bill Ackerley.
Yes.
So nice to have you here. I really appreciate your presenting a very balanced view of what's happening in Tibet. You sound like you really are bringing the policies of the Dalai Lama to us. It's wonderful to hear you talk about dialogue, which is his main critical issue of how to talk to people between two people who are so opposite. I'm so glad you're doing that. It's a wonderful job for you. Thank you very much for helping the Tibetans. As you know, my son was arrested in Tibet in 1987. Fortunately, he was not tortured or imprisoned. When he came back to the United States, that's 10 years ago, he volunteered for a group in Washington, D.C. called the International Campaign for Tibet. Now, someone asked, I think you asked, what can we do in this country? One of the things is joining this group in Washington called the International Campaign for Tibet. And they have done a tremendous job in lobbying on behalf of His Holiness. So others can join that too. And it's so good. I'm so pleased to see a lot of Tibetans here. I hope they will speak up because they've got so much to say. But thank you for coming.
Mr. Ackley is senior Ackley's son runs the International Campaign for Tibet, and so you can understand why father's promoting his son's organization. But son is doing a good job, I should say. And there are other organizations like Students for Free Tibet. If you're students in any schools and universities, you can join them. And then there are other Tibet support groups in Boston, in many places, so you can be active and join. And then, as Mr. Ackley said, I was kind of reflecting one view, that is Dalai Lama's view to promoting dialogue. But then there is another view. I should not leave that out. Otherwise, I might get into trouble in Tibetan society. Other view is that the Dalai Lama's approach of nonviolence, of negotiation, of dialogue with the Chinese government does not work. Not because he's wrong. He's right in the sense, if there is a way that you can solve the issue nonviolently through dialogue, it should be appreciated and implemented anywhere in the world. But the younger generation or the nationalist wing of the Tibetan society are saying, it's not that His Holiness Dalai Lama is wrong, it's that the partner to which he is trying to deal with is not the type who will listen to dialogue, peaceful means to resolve the issue. Hence, they're saying we should take matters into our own hands. They're saying, we should not go for autonomy or dialogue, but we should go for independence, which is our birthright. And we should remain ideologically pure and confront the Chinese government in any way possible so that they cannot do what they have been doing for the last 50 years. So there is this wing, and they're quite strong. In fact, they're getting stronger, actually. One reason, when the present tragedy started from 10th March on, His Holiness was asked what he could do. He said, really, I cannot do much. I felt sad, actually. I kind of felt sympathy for him because he really could not do much. Why? Because his hands were empty. He sent delegations after delegations to Beijing saying, let's deal this issue through negotiation. And Chinese government returned them empty-handed all the time. So His Holiness didn't have anything in his hands. So he could not do anything. So his hands were tight. Unfortunately, his hands were tightened by the Chinese government's inaction or lack of reciprocity. That is the problem.
Yes, my name is John Lampert, and another Chinese policy to just destroy the Tibetan culture is to wait for the Dalai Lama to pass away to die. He's 73 years old. And my question is, is there a plan being made to who would succeed the Dalai Lama, and how does all that happen? I mean, for example, could you yourself be the next Dalai Lama, or is that?
Can I have your email
this
address,
is a question
please?
this is a question of reincarnation here. This is a Buddhist question.
I don't mind that as a secular question as well. Yeah. Thank you very much. The Chinese hardliners' plan is to see His Holiness the Dalai Lama pass away. And their theory is that Tibet issue will be resolved automatically with him gone. And then based on that policy, they says we should be hardliner. We should just clamp down on Tibetans now, and we can win. And they also say that if you be more lenient to Tibetans, they'll rise up all the time. And they give examples of 50s. In 59, the Tibetan uprising, they said Chinese were lenient. That's why Tibetans rose up against the Chinese government. And in 80s, the early 80s, they were quite lenient. Hu Yaobang were quite lenient. And then 87, 88, 89, there were a series of uprisings. They said, look, if you are lenient to Tibetans, they will rise up. But then, this tragedy, the unfolding tragedy, kind of exposed their weakness. Because since 2005 and 6, the hardliners took over, and hardliners' policies were implemented quite ruthlessly. They just clamped down on all the monasteries. They, obviously, you can't have a photograph of His Holiness in Tibet. You get caught, you go to prison. But then they really implemented it quite strongly, right? And they also came out with regulations saying that any reincarnated Lama, if he or she is born, has to be registered and recognized by the district Communist Party. And they have come with a series of regulations, really clamping down on Tibetan people. Then this tragedy unfolded. Tibetans rose up, not just in Lhasa, but in 50 other areas, in all provinces of Kham and Amdo. This is unprecedented. Tibetans are united, and the universal appeal or slogan is long live the Dalai Lama, we want Dalai Lama to be back. Tibet is ours, we want our land back. That's what they're saying. So what it showed is that the hardliners' line of thinking, that if you just clamp down, if you just suppress people, you can suppress them forever, is being exposed. More you suppress, more it will explode. So in that sense, hardliners' theory is proven wrong. I hope the Chinese government will learn a lesson from this. Of course, they're embarrassed now. Of course, they're angry now. It's understandable. But when they calm down a bit, they should realize that when you impose hardline policy, when you try to suppress people, they will not remain suppressed for long. Why? If you look at history, always people have risen up, all the time. Suppression cannot keep people down all the time. So as for His Holiness Dalai Lama's passing away, do we have a plan? Yes, there is a natural plan. The 15th Dalai Lama will come. He will be born and recognized. And His Holiness has also proposed some interesting ideas, which has some religious and historical precedents. He has said maybe he can appoint the next Dalai Lama, a young boy. That's one option. So that before him passing away, there could be a boy, young boy, to be educated and groomed as the next Dalai Lama. That's one option. Actually, I like that option. Two is that he will have a referendum among all these Tibetan Buddhists, not just in India, but in Ladakh, Sikkim, Mongolia, and Kalmyk area. There are 3 Russian federations where they follow Tibetan Buddhism. They will vote to select or elect who the next Dalai Lama will be. So there are a couple of proposals being, thrown around, and then I would say we do have a plan. The other plans are we have young reincarnated lamas like Karmapa, like Ling Rinpoche, and Sakya Tongse. These are young in their 20s, and they are charismatic, they are learned, they speak good English, and and they're yet to come to the world, actually. So when they come out, you will see that these people are quite impressive people, you know. So perhaps they could lead from the religious point of view. And then we have a democratic system in exile. You know, as you might know, since 1990, Tibetans in 27 countries vote to elect the member of parliament, which has 43 members. And we vote to elect our prime minister since 2000. And just recently, we just elected the prime minister for the second term. So we have a functioning government with education department, religious department, and security, and finance, and foreign ministry. I studied in Tibetan refugee school run by Tibetan education department. So we do have a government in place which has democratic features. And then, so in that sense, institutionally, we are prepared, and we will have leadership as well as institutional structure that we need.
I wanted to ask about the situation with regards to neighboring countries, especially Nepal and India, with both very important, seeing as the government in exile in Upper Dharamsala, McLeod Ganj, and then also with a large number of Tibetans in Nepal. And I had been to the region 10 years ago, and since then, there's been dramatic changes in many ways between Beijing and New Delhi, their relationship. And you know, they haven't reached a formal final status agreement on the borders that are still in dispute from some of the wars they've had in decades past. But there's a massive increase in the trade between the two nations. There's been a thaw in some of the security relations. And I know in many ways they're in competition still, but when I was there, it seemed like they had a fair degree of prosperity and autonomy in terms of, and I was wondering how that would affect now. We see like in some ways we see in Kathmandu and other parts of Nepal and they're cracking down in relation to what's going on in Tibet itself now.
Thank you.
And do you think that's under threat at all, some of the privileges that the Tibetan exile community has in India and Nepal?
Yeah, as for India, you know, I would firstly say India is doing quite a lot because India is the first country which allowed Tibetan refugees to come and settle. And majority, almost 75% of Tibetans in the world are in India, and they provide us with schools, and you know, and let government function its own course. Having said that, recently His Holiness Dalai Lama himself said India is overcautious when it comes to dealing with China. Perhaps India thinks they're doing their share by allowing Tibetans to settle in India and do all these things, right? On the other hand, India has this kind of a second fiddle psychological mindset when it comes to the Chinese government or China, because they lost the war in 1962. Since then, it's kind of Indians feel maybe we are not as equal to China. So, and on that basis, actually, they don't come out and say very strongly in support of Tibet, and they are very cautious, actually. But having said that, actually, Indian people in general are quite sympathetic to Tibet. And also, as you said, because India and China are two giants in Asia, you know, inevitably, and it is already happening, they are in competition at political level, at economic level, and as part of civilization. So India finds Tibet as a good card to play when it comes to China, even though they don't come out and say strongly, you know. So I would say India is doing its best, and it could do more and much more as far as Tibetans are concerned. But as far as Nepal is concerned, it's really unfortunate because there's landlocked, you know, and they're sandwiched between India and China, and they're taking hints from Chinese government quite literally. And if you look at Tibetan protesters outside UN buildings or Chinese embassy, they are really physically beaten up every day, actually. And I just learned that the police just go straight to Tibetans' head or their legs with their bamboo sticks, you know. It's unfortunate that Nepal has stooped so low in taking dictates from the Chinese government. And I think Human Rights Watch has come out with a report saying that this is unacceptable and Nepal should not be doing this, because Tibetans, all they're doing is peacefully. They're standing before the UN buildings and the Chinese embassy and shouting some slogans. For that, they don't deserve to be beaten up. But Nepal is doing that. So I think it's unfortunate.
I think that if you haven't already talked about it in any detail, I'd appreciate it if you could amplify anything you may already have said about the Beijing Olympics as this tremendous opportunity to really make progress on the issue of Tibet. I think, as an American citizen, that our government, the current administration, isn't going to do anything, or will try very hard not to do anything. Citizen activism is going to be tremendous and actually may achieve something. We saw the other day when the beginning of the torch ceremony, I thought tremendous activity in support of the people of Tibet. I guess, I know it's a difficult thing for you or anyone as a Tibetan to talk about here in the United States, I would guess, but I would ask you to talk a little bit about the history of the United States government in the evolution of the situation of Tibet. Of course, people you know better than I, the history, the CIA intervention in the 50s, which was squelched, and the abandonment, which actually some of the CIA people felt a responsibility for and have taken an interest in Tibet ever since. But more recently, the way in which the United States government really seems to be quite prepared to allow the status quo to continue. And so I wonder sort of some analytical assessment of the United States policy toward the issue of Tibet, and maybe what we Americans can do to push our government.
Thank you. Good question.
Thank you very much. Two big questions, I think. I'll have to give 2 talks on that. So if you're prepared to spend 2 more hours, I'm ready to go. But in a nutshell, and as I said in my presentation, despite all these, the heavy-handedness brought by the Chinese government on Tibetan people, His Holiness still maintains that boycotting the Olympics is not a good thing. But there are theories, there are people, as you were not here, so the people are talking about boycotting not the Olympics, but the opening ceremony. I think 25 or 26 athletes from France are saying they will do something to that effect, and they have written an open letter. So that thing is going on, actually. In that sense, actually, it's a great opportunity for Tibetans to use Olympic. Now the tragedy in Tibet has unfolded, so to use that as a leverage. Because today only, actually, Chinese government is taking 10 or so journalists to Tibet in a guided tour, There was an AP report saying that the 40 kilometers distance from the airport to Lhasa normally takes, 45 minutes. The bus was driven so slowly that all the journalists were shouting at the bus driver saying, "Why can't you drive fast? We want to reach there and get out and investigate." So and then it was a guided tour. Not much is being seen and reported. But the fact that Chinese government is still even doing that is because they fear that there might be implication as far as organizing the Olympics is concerned. Tibet was getting invaded and occupied by China. The U.S. ambassador in India was very strongly urging His Holiness Dalai Lama to come out. He was promising that he will do anything possible to provide refuge in Thailand, in India, or even in America. And then he was promising a lot of things. And at that time, the Secretary of State was also quite supportive of the Tibet issue. And that's how eventually, in 1958, CIA got involved, actually. CIA got involved not on their own, actually. CIA got involved because of the ambassadors and the State Department's commitment to help Tibet. Got involved to train 200 Tibetans in camp held in Colorado and some in Okinawa Island in Japan, actually. So many of them were airdropped to Tibet, including my uncle, and who never came back, actually. So many of the Tibetans died. And later, after Tibet was occupied in 1959, some of those guerrillas who fought really bravely against the Chinese army, they came to India, and then they all were sent to a place called Lobsang in Nepal. There they formed the base camp, and from there they were making raids, and they were fighting against the Chinese army from time to time. Actually, one of the biggest accomplishment of CIA at that time was they got this report of the real situation that was happening in China, including the tragedy of the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward. And that report they got it through the Tibetan guerrillas' raid on Chinese convoy that was passing by from Xinjiang to Tibet down south to China, actually. But Henry Kissinger and Nixon went to Beijing, shook hands, made deals, and then they just left Tibetans high and dry in the mountains of Mustang. Many Tibetans felt they felt betrayed because America promised so many things, but at that crucial moment, they were just cut off. Actually, even the breakup was so sudden. Even a girlfriend, when they get that kind of breakup, I think they will come after you. The CIA officers came and said, "This is it. We are leaving. This is the end of the story." I said, "Why? No explanation." They just went, and many Tibetans, actually, many brave Tibetans, they could not take it. And then His Holiness also appealed. That has been his principle to practice nonviolence, actually. He also made an appeal Tibetans to disarm, because Nepal was going to move in and crack down on Tibetan guerrillas at that time. So many Tibetans felt betrayed by America and actually died, committed suicides. Some just slit their throat. Some jumped into a river. Many died, actually, because of that. So there's a sad chapter as far as America's relationship with Tibet is also concerned. Since 80s, and especially late 80s, with the rise of human rights agenda in the international forum, and U.S. using human rights as a tool has been supportive, at least the U.S. Congress. And U.S. presidents from time to time, to the extent that they invite His Holiness to the White House, not to the Oval Office, but some map room or some other rooms, And before, Clinton used to drop by with his coffee in his hand in Al Gore's office. George Bush is a little better in that sense. I know the People's Republic of Cambridge won't like to hear good things about George Bush, but he's a little better in that sense. He literally receives His Holiness at the door, and then takes him into, not to the Oval Office, but to another office. But he doesn't pretend to drop in. He just says, "I'm meeting him," And recently he attended the U.S. Congressional Gold Medal ceremony in the Congress Rotunda. So moral support, quite good. Actual support, not so much.
Just to note, the Cambridge Forum had this sheet that should be around. Not sure where they all are, but it has a number of books for people who want to learn more about Tibet and the history of Tibet. It's quite a good list. Please, I think this will be our last question.
Yes, the question I'd like to ask is this. Tibet is effectively a sovereign nation, and historically it's a sovereign nation. Why doesn't it use the forum of the United Nations, even though it's not a member of the United Nations? There's enough world support for the mechanism of the United Nations to be used, because there's basically global support. I personally think that the Olympics is simply a public relations opportunity to raise the issue and the profile of the Tibetan problem. It seems to me that looking for a long-term solution The United Nations has to be the right mechanism to do that. I'd be interested to know your view about that.
Thank you for that question. Yes, historically, if you look at the history of Tibet, I didn't get into it because that will be another talk. For most part of the history, Tibet was an independent nation. So there is a brief period where the Chinese influence in early 18th century to mid-century is there. But that does not prove that Tibet was a province of China. Other than that, I think there's hardly any historians who dispute the fact that Tibet was an independent nation throughout the history. And from 1911 to 1951, even some scholars who lean more towards China have acknowledged that Tibet was an independent nation. So yes, based on history and international law, self-determination, one can make the case that Tibet deserves to be an independent nation. But unfortunately, UN is not the forum, it seems, because UN General Assembly is just an advisory body. It can pass resolution, but cannot implement it. It's the Security Council which implements it, actually. They can pass their own resolution and implement. So China is a veto power-holding member of the Security Council. They can veto any resolution that comes up in the UN Security Council. So in that sense, for Tibetans, UNO does not stand for United Nations Organization. Rather, it might stand for Useless Nations Organizations. That's a sad reality because of geopolitics and the influence of the Chinese government.
Yes, sorry if I may. I accept that that China has the power of veto, but would it not raise the profile of the whole subject on an international stage, and even if it exercised its veto, the opinion of debate in the United Nations would make China realize even more where world opinion lies on the subject?
Yes, UN has different institutional mechanism, from UN Security Council to General Assembly to Economic and Social Council to Human Rights Council, and you can go to UN Minority Rights Commission, and then UN conferences like that. So there is a hierarchy of institution that one can utilize. I have attended a couple of conferences, and especially the UN Human Rights Commission, and also Minority Rights Commission in Geneva. But every UN institution or forum has procedures in place. And especially at UN Minorities Rights Commission, one procedure is called something like non-action resolution. So if an NGO comes and tables a resolution or an issue, right, immediately China will say, we will have non-action resolution. I just want to use that power. And then immediately before the issue is being discussed, they will put to vote, even to discuss the issue or not. And then you lose out, because sad reality is that many of the third world countries, they're scared of China, or they are influenced by China, and they support China's resolution. So these, most of the human rights violators like Cuba, North Korea, Burma, Saudi Arabia, they have their own coalition, and through which they make sure that whenever there is an election in the Human Rights Council, they make sure that their members or their supporters are elected, and often they are the majority. And then they will say, before the issue is even discussed, they will say, non-action resolution. There's something like that. And then you just have to vote even to discuss the issue or not. Often there you fail. So only in UN Human Rights Commission, I think in 1990, Tibet managed to sneak in a resolution in support of Tibet and human rights in China. That's because of Tiananmen Square, because of the overwhelming support of the international community. Even those human rights violators at that time were a little embarrassed, to come out openly. And those who were in the middle, I think they sided toward one side, and that's when there was one resolution passed. So we should make efforts, we should use every forum possible to raise the issue of Tibet, to force debate. That is for sure. But UN as a mechanism on its own, it's quite weak.
One last very, very short question.
This is a comment. For people who don't know about the petition that's going around the world on the internet, it's at www.avaaz.org, A-V-A-A-Z, and it's under Stop the Violence. And the goal was to get 1 million signatures. They're beyond that, but more signatures is good. Thanks.
Yeah, actually the campaign has reached 1 million signatures, and then they are going for 2 million actually. So if you it's online, and if you sign up, it kind of raises profile of the Tibet issue, and especially shows support of international community on the issue of Tibet.
www.avaaz.org. And you'll see a picture of His Holiness.
I just want to make one last comment, because most of you, I assume, are Americans. And today you heard the Tibetan side of the story, so it's very likely, or hopefully, you will meet some Chinese from mainland China. And when you have debate, especially who has read Chinese government propaganda, will throw this line at you, throw this curveball at you and say, oh, you're Americans, so what you did to Native Americans. So they will say as though you have no right to speak on behalf of Tibet or in support of Tibet. So when I hear this, I always say this to Chinese friends and scholars, and I say, thank you for acknowledging that you are treating Tibetans like Americans treated Native Indians. Now, when you know the fact that Americans did not treat Native Americans right, then why do you want to repeat the same mistake? 2 wrongs does not make it right, So, in fact, there is a treaty between Tibetans and one of the tribal Native Americans tribal group in upstate New York. That treaty essentially says, we support Tibetan people. Don't use our suffering as a justification or excuse to inflict sufferings on Tibetan people, So, so if you meet, that's the one thing they will throw at you, and be prepared to throw it back. And then, and also one could say, just because Hitler committed Holocaust, it does not give another dictator to commit Holocaust. Just because Mao Zedong committed Cultural Revolution, it does not give George Bush to commit Cultural Revolution. So you can't make right by 2 wrongs, actually. So I think you should acknowledge first. You should appreciate for the acknowledgement, and then respond to them kindly with a smile. And I hope they will listen to you. Thanks.